This is the moment you've been waiting for all year. When fish start blowing up your dry flies, smacking them like those flies just asked their sister to the prom. It's terrestrial season when some of the biggest bugs of the year are finally on the menu. These are your bugs like ants, grasshoppers, and cicadas. And if you're prepared, this might just be your best chance at catching a truly huge fish on a dry fly. This week on Untangled, you're going to learn all about terrestrials. From our favorite patterns to a few tips for fishing them, you're going to end the show ready to put your personal best in the net. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Now, I know that the hook to today's show might have sounded a little hyperbolic, but I promise, terrestrial season really is that good. Shoot, last year, one of the best fish I caught all year long was a 22-inch rainbow trout that was fat enough to make me feel skinny, so you know it was a stout fish. And I caught that on a hopper last year, so it really can be a wonderful time to get into some truly memorable fish. But before we dive into everything you need to know about terrestrials so you can have an experience like that for yourself, I want to set the stage for what we're going to talk about in the Q&A section of the show, which is coming up here. Imagine that you're out on a lake. There's fish rising everywhere, and you can even see some mayflies on the water. So you feel really good about it. You throw a few out there, and every fly you throw gets ignored. How long do you go before you switch flies? And how do you troubleshoot your way out of a situation like that so you don't go home skunked again? That's what we're going to cover, again, in the Q&A section of the show this week, so stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss that. But let's bring it back to the terrestrials, the main star of this part of the show this week. We're going to go ahead and explain exactly what terrestrials are. We're going to take a look at their life cycle, and then we'll go into a few tips for fishing them, and we will end with a list of the patterns that all of us here at VFC love and use all the time, the stuff that we're actually starting to break out right now, because this is the very beginning of hopper season and terrestrial season. So, terrestrial insects, they are the insects that hatch and grow up on land. They don't spend any of their life in the water, unlike your aquatic insects like your mayflies and your caddis and your stoneflies. Okay, your grasshoppers, your ants, your crickets, your beetles, and your cicadas are all examples of terrestrial insects that, one way or another, even though they spend their lives on land, they will end up in the water somehow, and they end up on the menu for fish to eat. They end up that way because a lot of these bugs will hang out on a lot of streamside vegetation, and then if there's a lot of wind or if they just slip, they'll fall into the water, and then that's when they're on the menu, and the fish can go ahead and gobble them on up. So the fish are aware that these are food items, but it's not a consistent, predictable hatch in the same way that like your mayflies or your caddis are. It's a little sporadic. It just kind of depends on a few different factors. But the general rule of thumb is that terrestrial fishing is going to be best on your hot, windy days because your terrestrial insects are going to be most active in that heat. And then the wind is going to blow them off of that streamside vegetation and into the water again, putting them on the menu. So those hot, windy days, that's when you want to bust out the big foam bugs and go for it. Now, your cicadas are generally going to be the first terrestrial that's available to fish because they tend to emerge earlier on in the year. Once we start getting some warmer temps, a lot of the cicada hatches that I fish here in the Rockies, you see them from June through early July, usually their peak. It might be a little different timing throughout the rest of the country, but generally they're going to be the first one that shows up. Again, you need a few bouts of warm weather. They are pretty temperature dependent, but once you get a few days of warmth stacked on top of each other, the cicadas will come out. They'll start falling off the trees. They'll get blown into the water, and the fish will go nuts for them. It's a lot of fun. You get into a good cicada hatch, and it is not going to be something you will forget anytime soon. It'll be like your first Diet Coke or your first basket of wings. You're going to remember exactly where you were, what you were doing, how it felt. You're not going to forget a single detail of that moment. So your cicadas are up first. Your ants are going to be the ones that are probably available next. And the rule of thumb with them is once you start seeing ants crawling around as you walk to the river, maybe they show up in your house. Because let's just talk about that for a minute. It is the year 2025. And we somehow still put up with spiders and ants and earwigs and other creepy crawlies in the house. And I, for one, am sick of it. So I'm calling on pest control companies. Step your game up, all right? I pay for pest control, okay? I pay a hefty amount every month to get sprayed, and I don't want to see these critters in my house anymore. So pest control and builders, y'all got to figure something out so these guys don't come in my house anymore, especially not at 2 a.m. Oh, anyways. Once you start seeing ants crawling around doing their thing, good rule of thumb to go ahead and start fishing them. Ants are going to be available once you see them all the way through summer up until that first big frost in fall. And something interesting about ants that I've come to realize a lot more over the last couple of years is they play a much larger role in a fish's diet than I realized for a lot of years. And I think a much larger role than most anglers realize. I think a lot of us overlook the ant and just how important it is. We get really caught up in matching the aquatic insect hatches, and for good reason. It's fun to fish the mayflies and the caddis. They're very elegant looking bugs, but the ants really are a solid backbone of food for fish during the summer months. You go read any articles and magazines, especially from 30, 40 years ago, you find a lot of the old timers talking about ants and just how valuable they are. And then I never really connected the dots in my head. And so if you're in that same boat, don't worry, but they are very important. And I really could probably do an entire episode on the value of ants. Maybe I will at some point, but the takeaway here is make sure you've got a few in your box, because when the fish aren't rising, but it's a nice hot windy day, maybe you haven't seen any hoppers yet, ants are going to be a great go-to. They're going to just be a great fly. You can get into tons of fish with ants that probably otherwise wouldn't eat a whole lot. So those will be your ants. You'll also take that same approach with your crickets and your beetles. Once you start seeing and hearing them, that's when you can start fishing them. And again, make sure you're fishing those on those hot, windy days. That's best for terrestrial action.
Hey there, it's Alex. You ever find yourself standing in the river, staring at your open fly box, wondering, what the heck do I tie on? Yeah, it happens to all of us, especially if you're not quite sure what bugs are active. That's why we've put together our year-round hatch chart. It breaks down the major hatches that happen across the US so you can understand what's happening in your neck of the woods and pick the right fly with confidence. Snag a free copy by scanning the QR code on the screen or hit the link in the show notes. All right, back to Untangled.
Now let's go ahead and talk about, I think, the star of a terrestrial season, and that's going to be your hoppers. We call it hopper season for a reason, because I think we all look forward to these ones the most. This is probably what we're thinking of when we think of fishing with big foam bugs. We're thinking of fishing grasshopper patterns. They are the dessert of summer fishing, right? They're the last course. They're the giant waffle cone from that hole-in-the-wall ice cream joint that's been the same since you were a kid. It's looked like they've never scrubbed the floors in all the years you've been going there. And fish react that way to them. They really do. They hit them with that same nostalgic fervor that you do when you go to that ice cream joint. And hopper season really kicks up right about now. The end of summer things are really starting to heat up. A lot of the big aquatic insect hatches are over. The stoneflies are all done. They've been done for about a month now. Your mayflies are just wrapping up. You might still have some PMDs kicking around, but the main game in town is going to be your caddis and your midges. And fish are going to go ahead and keep eating hoppers until that first big frost of the year. And they're the big ticket item now because, yes, your caddis and midges are active, but once the hoppers come on the scene, you think a fish wants a size 16 caddis or a size 10 hopper? Yeah, I know which one I'm going for, right? I'm just like the fish, maximum amount of food for the least amount of effort. Now, hoppers are going to end up in the water for the same reason that all your other terrestrial insects do. They are either blown there or they're chilling on a bush or a tree stream side, and they just fall and end up right there, on the water. So what this means is that most of the time, your hoppers are going to end up falling in the river along the banks. It's going to be rare, not completely uncommon, though, to see them out in the middle of the river. So for the most part, a lot of your hopper fishing is going to be focused along the banks. And that holds true for most of your terrestrials. The only one that I really would say ends up in the middle of the river the most, from my experience, is going to be your cicadas, just because I watch them get blown a little bit further than I do with the hoppers consistently. I'm not sure why, but that's just from my own 2 cents or from my own experience. That's what I see. So you're going to want to focus on landing your hoppers and fishing them nice and tight to the banks. Get them right up there, snug them right up. Because on top of that, summer, late summer, your flows have started to drop in the rivers. The water is getting very clear. So the fish are going to hug the banks where there's a little bit more cover, where there's shade. The water might be a little bit cooler. They're going to feel a lot more protected there than they are exposed in a riffle or a run that's a foot lower now than it was a month ago, just because that's what your water levels do throughout the year. They decrease. So the fish are also going to be tucked up on those edges a lot as well. Now, one thing that's a lot of fun with hoppers is you don't got to be gentle with them. This ain't like holding the baby where you got to be careful about it. No, you can just, you can really get kind of, rough's not the right word. You can have some fun. That's the way I'll phrase it. You can have some fun with putting hoppers down on the water. They don't need to land like a butterfly with sore feet the way you want your mayflies to land. Mayflies are very graceful. They're very elegant. Caddis, they don't splat on the water either. Your hoppers, though, they fall in with a splat. When they end up falling into that water, again, water's not their not climate. I'm trying to think their habitat. That's the word I'm looking for. Water's not their habitat. So when they fall in there, it's a surprise. They make a splat. It kind of like me when I slip and fall in the river. It is an event that the fish are not going to ignore. And this doesn't mean that you can just slam your hoppers on the water like you're chucking rocks. That's not natural either. They don't hit that hard. But a bit of a splash, a bit of noise when that hopper lands isn't a bad thing at all, because that's going to very closely mimic the reality of what happens when hoppers do end up in the water. And this holds true for your crickets, your beetles, even your ants to an extent as well. Water's not their natural habitat. So when they fall in there, they're going to freak you out. It's not like the aquatic insects that spend almost their entire lives in the water. So fish can react pretty quickly when your hoppers hit the water. There can be a very immediate reaction, a very immediate take on that. Again, hitting it like that fly just asked their sister out to the prom. So you'll want to be prepped to set the hook once you land your hoppers down there on the water. But the fish can also get a little suspicious of it sometimes, especially when the water's really low and clear. They won't always smack it right off the bat. A couple of weeks ago, I was out fishing with a buddy of mine, and we were just on the local stream here, and the water is nice and low and clear right now. It's almost too warm to fish, so I don't know if I'll actually be able to fish it again before the fall. But we're out there, we're throwing hoppers, and come up to this little pocket. And I just had one of our chubby Chernobyls here from VFC on, and throw it out there. And this fish comes up 3 times on 3 separate drifts to inspect my hopper. And he follows it, and he's looking at it, and he's critiquing the dubbing color that got used and how many turns the whip finish was on the head. He's really inspecting everything about this fly. And he eventually did eat, but sometimes you'll see that where they really just look at everything about it, and they're kind of like, oh, hey, is that a hopper? Hey, Fred, get up. Fred, is that the grasshopper you're telling me about? Yeah, I'm going to eat it. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no, it's gone. Oh, wait, it's back. I'm going to eat it now. They really kind of go through that phase, it feels like. And that one ate, but then I had another one in another hole. He went ahead and refused it after 3 or 4 drifts. So when the fish keep refusing it, when they're coming up and they're inspecting it, but they keep refusing it, that's when you might want to change up your colors and your sizes just a little bit. I found color matters with your hoppers more than you might think. So it pays to watch what size and color the hoppers are when you're walking to the river. Just that way you can make sure you're matching what's actually coming up through the grass. Because when you're walking to the river, you're kicking hoppers up. Those are going to be the same bugs that are going to be right next to the river. So if you can match those, get a good look at them, that's really going to help you more closely match what's available to the fish. When I get refusals like that, though, when they come up in that clear water and they look at it, and Fred tells them, no, don't eat that, dude. It's got a hook in it. When Fred tells him that, I generally switch up the color first because I tend to fish smaller hoppers on average. I really like 10s and 12s. I'll go down to an 8 if I need to, if I'm fishing a really big nymph underneath it, heavy hopper dropper rig. But I like the smaller hoppers because they're a little bit easier for the fish to get in their mouths. I've noticed that I tend to hook them in the mouth more with the smaller hoppers. The bigger hoppers, sometimes you can hook them in the eye, you can hook them in the side of the face a little bit. And I don't want to do that. I want to make sure I'm not harming the fish as much as possible. So I really like those smaller ones. But they're still big enough that they get the attention of the fish. They still make enough of a splat when they hit the water. They're also a lot easier to cast too, especially on 5 weights, than those bigger, heavy foam bugs. And that's just a general rule, right? The big flies are harder to cast than smaller flies are. So that's why I like going ahead and fishing those smaller ones. So I'll switch up the color first because I'm already sized down a little bit. So that's some general tips about them. I got to tell one other story though, just to finish out the section about tips, because it really illustrates another important aspect of how hoppers act and how fish react to them. So I don't even remember how many years ago this was now, but I was out with my buddy Blair. We were out fishing on this big river. Neither of us had ever fished before, and it's full of cutthroat. So we thought, it's going to be easy. We don't have to do any research beforehand. We don't have to worry about having the right flies. We're going to be fine. It's cutthroat. They're easy, right? They're like Durant when you give him wings. Okay, they're easy. I'll do whatever you want. You give me a plate of wings, yeah, I'll mow your lawn for a plate of wings, of course. So we're out there, get there at sunup. We start fishing, don't catch anything, and then we continue fishing and still don't catch anything. And we went all day long, fished miles of this river, did not catch squat. And we were really scratching our heads. So we head back to town. There's a town not too far from the river. We head back to town and we go into a fly shop and we ask, what are we doing wrong? This river's not supposed to be this hard. And the fly shop guy, bless his heart, and I mean that in the complimentary way, not the southern, like, oh, darn it, bless your heart way. But he was real nice. And he said, look, it's hopper season, because it was mid-August when we were there. It says hopper season. You gotta use these hoppers. So he hands us a couple of chubby Chernobyls. And then he says something that threw me for a loop. He says, when you land it on the water, give it a little twitch. I looked at him. I said, what? He says, yeah, just twitch it. So I scratching my head, just wondering, why would I twitch it? I want a dead, drag-free drift, right? That's what fish want. Well, yes and no. Because if you think about it, when a hopper lands in the water, is it just going to sit there and not struggle and not try to get back to the bank? Because again, water is not its natural habitat. Your mayflies, your caddis, your midges, your stoneflies, they're used to the water. Yes, they want to get out of it, dry their wings off, and mate, but they're not going to freak out the way that a hopper will, because a hopper, again, is not used to it at all. So it makes a little bit of sense when you think about it from that perspective. And I took the fly shop guy's advice. We went back up to the river. It was evening. We only had a couple hours before dark. We slapped those chubbies down on the water, give them a little twitch, and boom, fish were smacking them like they were going out of style. And we caught more fish than we knew what to do with the rest of the night. Just that little twitch, it really made the difference. So if you're not getting bites on your hoppers, if you're getting a lot of fish that are interested or maybe rejecting it, try adding that little twitch, because again, those hoppers, they're not just going to stay completely still in the water. There's going to be movement. They want to get out of the water. So a little bit of twitch actually looks lifelike. It's more closely mimicking the real thing. And again, that's your job as an angler at the end of the day. You got to put flies in front of fish and make them look real. All right, let's round things out with a look at our favorite hopper patterns. All of these are available to buy in 3-packs from VFC. So I'll throw a link to those in the show notes or right up here on the screen. If you are watching the video podcast, you can grab a few of these, get ready for our wonderful hopper season. Now, up first is going to be the longtime favorite, the venerable chubby Chernobyl. This is the OG, the goat, the foam, the goat of the foam hopper patterns. It floats forever. It's very simple, very easy to tie, and creates a really nice silhouette on the water. It can also double as a stonefly. It has the same general shape and size as a lot of stoneflies. So it's just a great fly to have in your box. You can use them really from June all the way till that big first frost of the year. And we've got our standard chubby that comes in tan. Then we've also got a golden stone chubby with a brown body to imitate that golden stonefly. And then the salmon fly chubby, which is a black body with some orange in it to imitate the stoneflies. So if you want to get a few different colors of these, you can go ahead and stock those up, because then during hopper season, if you need to switch the color up a little bit, you've got options. That's what's great about the chubby. Really easy to switch up colors. Again, just a wonderful fly. Got to have it in your box. Next one I recommend is the hippie stomper. This is going to imitate a lot of different terrestrial insects like your beetles. It's a good beetle imitation, but it floats really high, and it's really easy to see because there's this big poly yarn wing on it. It's a great way to switch it up from the standard chubby style hopper patterns, especially if you're fishing pressured water where the fish are probably seeing a lot of chubbies. You can throw a hippie stomper out, just change things up a little bit, just as a silhouette that's different enough that the fish will key in on it a bit. The Royal Flush is our next one, and this has become a top 5 pattern for me since we came up with it at VFC. I absolutely love it. It's basically just a royal wolf with a foam back. So you've got all that wonderful color and contrast of the royal wolf, and fish love all that color and contrast, but then it's got the foam to help with the durability and to help it float. It's a little bit smaller. I think they're a size 12. It's got just a little slimmer profile to it as well. So it's nice to use on flat, clear water because it doesn't make as big of a splash. It's more of a subtle and a sneakier terrestrial. Just a wonderful little pattern. It's really hard for me to talk it up too much. I love the Royal Flush. Next up, we've got Amy's Ant. As its name suggests, it's just an ant pattern, first and foremost, but it's also buggy enough that it's just kind of an attractor style bug that will really get the attention of a lot of fish So you can use this in your dry dropper rigs if you want to. It's another great way to just switch things up from the chubby. The chubbies get fished all the time, and for good reason. They're very effective. But if you're on water that's getting a lot of pressure, it's nice to have different terrestrial options just to throw something a little different at the fish. And the Amy's ant can help fill that niche for you. The high-vis beetle is next, and yep, it's beetle pattern, as the name suggests. But it really could pull double duty as a cicada in a pinch. It's got the same general shape as a cicada, and it's just got enough buggy characteristics about it that it'll really act as an attractor as well. Your beetles are a great option a little bit earlier in the season before the hoppers are really on the menu too, so you can have these in the box earlier. Start fishing them again when you see them, usually about the same time frame as when you can start fishing ants. The Moorish hopper is a really solid go-to grasshopper imitation. It's really designed to imitate a hopper a lot more closely. So that's what it's going for. It's not trying to imitate a lot of terrestrials. It's really trying to just be a hopper. So if you're kicking up a ton of hoppers as you're walking through the grass to the river, or again, if the fish aren't liking your chubby, the Moorish hopper can be that little secret sauce that you need to really get the fish to go ahead and eat. Now, I'm going to throw you a curveball here because the next one is the sunken ant. Most of our terrestrial fishing is done with dry flies, and that's been the entire list so far, has been big foam body dry flies. But ants, when they fall into the river, they're not always going to float. A lot of the times they're going to end up sinking. They're just really not that buoyant like other terrestrials are. So sinking an ant and fishing it like a nymph is actually a sneaky little way to pull a bunch of fish out of a run, especially if it's hot and it's windy, there's not aquatic insect activity going on, and the fish aren't rising to anything. You tie on a little sunken ant, you are going to be in business. It's a great little fly. And then last but not least is the bionic ant. This is one of the most well-known ant patterns out there, and that's really just because it works. It floats great, looks just like an ant. Alex just caught a few fish on it last week during a filming trip he and I were out on. So it's really easy to see too on the water, especially in the rough water since it's mostly foam. It's going to be pretty durable as well. So just all around a really good ant pattern. I definitely like it better than the dubbing ants. Those are always so hard for me to see on the water. So that wraps up our list of terrestrials, and that wraps up our discussion on terrestrials as well. So if you learned anything new or you've got a favorite terrestrial pattern that you would like to share with us, go ahead and drop a comment below and let us know. And then also don't forget, you can grab any of the flies that I just mentioned in a 3-pack from our website. There's a link for that in the show notes, or once again here on the screen as well. So now it is time to head into the Q&A section for this week's show. Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, you can go ahead and send those in. There's a link to do that in the show notes, or there's a QR code here on the screen for those of you watching the video podcast. Nathan from Colorado's got our first question this week, writes in and says, earlier this July, I went out to fly fish a lake looking to catch my first brook or tiger trout. After getting out on the water, I noticed a lot of fish surfacing really aggressively, so I tied up a dry fly and got to fishing. I fished at the lake for a full 8 hours and tied on 5 to 10 different flies of varying size and style, and couldn't get a fish to even look at my fly. I even pulled a mayfly off of the water and matched my dry fly directly to him with 0 results, despite watching fish surface 5 to 10 feet away from me all day long. I'm guessing I just couldn't find the right pattern for whatever the fish were eating. My question is, how long would you fish with a certain pattern tied on before you switch it out with something of a different color or size? I really appreciate all the work you guys put into teaching noobs like myself how to enjoy our time out on the water. Nathan, good question, and thank you. Appreciate it. I'm going to try and help you troubleshoot this exact situation because I was in it a couple of months ago myself, so I feel the pain. I understand what you're going through. And like with most things we talk about here on the show, the concepts of changing your flies on rivers and lakes really do translate fairly well. So to answer your question directly, if I'm on a lake with fish rising, I'm going to fish what I think is the right fly until the fish tell me that it's wrong. So there is no set timetable. I'm just waiting for feedback from the fish. And that feedback of them telling me it's wrong usually happens by them coming up to inspect my fly and then refusing it at the last moment, or rising to eat a natural right next to my fly. That's telling me that there's something wrong with my presentation or my fly itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is size down my tippet first, because especially in lakes, fish can be pretty tippet shy. So if I do that, I've got thinner tippet on there, less of a disturbance on the water, and the fish are still refusing my fly. That's when I'll go ahead and actually change the pattern out, go to a different color, different size, maybe a different bug entirely. So that's to directly answer the question. That's how I would approach it. Wait until the fish tell you that it's wrong and then move on to something else. But the other question here is the one that you didn't ask, but I think that you still want answered is, how do you know what to change it to? What fly do you use? It's nice to know, yeah, I need to change my fly now, but would also be very nice to know what fly to change it to. So you did the exact right thing by watching and waiting for a minute and grabbing a real bug and matching it. That's exactly what you should do. And 90% of the time, that's going to work for you. So keep doing it. Don't stray away from that. That is a great way to problem solve. What sounds like your issue is that the fish were eating emerging insects instead of the adults up on the top. And for those who aren't aware, your aquatic insects go through this life cycle where they start out as a nymph. They start out underwater and they live underwater for a little bit. They grow up. And then once they're ready to leave the house, they've graduated high school, they bought a van, they're going to go on a cross-country road trip, they turn into what's called an emerger. It's the stage in between the nymph and the winged adult, sometimes called a dun. And that emerger shoots up through the water and moves quickly. Sometimes they can move very quickly, especially in lakes, up through the water to get to the surface where they're going to bust out of their nymphal shuck. They're going to grow their wings. They're going to dry their wings off, and then they'll fly away to mate as an adult. But that emerging insect, that movement especially, can be something that fish key in on. So in this instance, where you grabbed a real adult mayfly off the water and you matched that to something in your box and you felt really confident about that and you still didn't catch anything, I would have gone ahead and switched over to an emerger at that point, because that's telling me if you've got an exact match for what's out there in the water, that's telling me that's not actually what they're eating. It might look like it, but that might not be the bug they're actually gulping down. You can also tell if they're eating emergers or the adult, the dun, based on how they rise. But on lakes, sometimes the emerger rises can be kind of confusing. If the fish are aggressively rising, they're jumping all the way out of the water, or if the water is clear enough and you can actually watch the fish shoot up through the water, almost like they're chasing a fly, that can be a sign that they're chasing emergers as they rise up through that water column. And then sometimes that energy they spend chasing the emergers results in them breaking the surface and kind of making that jump like the shark from Shark Week eating the seal. And I've had this happen to me before. There was this lake I used to fish back when I lived in Utah, and I really want to get back there. I haven't fished it in a long time. It's a beautiful little lake, and it's got cutthroat and brook trout in it. And the cutthroat would do this all the time. I didn't see the brookies do it as much, but the cutthroat would, where you would watch them launch themselves out of the water after these flies. And I was in this same boat where I could not figure out what dry fly to tie on. And this was earlier on in my fly fishing career. And I was there with a buddy one day at this lake. And I'm explaining to him what's going on. He says, oh, well, they're eating emergers. And he hands me an ice cream cone chironomid and says, fish it like a foot below the surface. So I did. And it's just a big midge pattern is all it is. And wouldn't you know it, I caught a whole bunch of fish that day. Just fishing that a foot below the surface because that's what the fish were actually going after. So sometimes you will see that happen. But generally speaking, the emerger rises on lakes are still going to be soft and subtle, just the way they are on a river, where the fish don't make too much noise. They don't make very much disturbance on the water. And you'll usually only see their dorsal and their tail fin break the surface. If you see the fish's nose and head come clean out of the water, that usually means they're eating the adults. So bottom line, change the flies up a little bit more quickly on lakes than you do in a river, especially when it comes to dry flies, because they might just be eating emergers. And if you're new to lake fishing, it can sometimes be hard to tell the difference between what's going on. And then I would also say it's not a bad idea to have a lot of different colors of the same fly on hand, because I tend to run into fish that care about color way more when I'm fishing lakes than I do on rivers. And an example of that's a couple of months ago, Alex and I were out fishing. Alex runs the media side of VFC with me, and we were out fishing together on this little pond. And the fish were going nuts, rising, big fish rising too, rising to everything except my fly. And I tried everything in my box. I did not have something that they wanted. And I finally stopped fishing for a minute. I watched and I could see these big tan midges. And I did not have a big tan midge. I had big black ones and I had big, I think I had some gray ones too, but I didn't have a tan one. And they really wanted that tan one because I think Alex ended up catching one on a tan-ish colored dry fly, if I remember that trip correctly. So sometimes they really will get that picky just about the color. So make sure you've got a few different colors on hand because I think that'll do you well. But I appreciate the question. If you got any more feedback on it, please feel free to drop a comment. Thanks. Colin from the US has our next question, writes in and says, do you ever run your dry off of a tag and leave your nymph as your point fly? I found having the dry on a tag lets it drift more freely since it isn't in line with the sinking nymph, and then you can also be in contact with the nymph. I just do a surgeon's knot up my leader and tie the dry fly off of the tag about 12 inches long. Colin, this is a good question. Thanks for sending it in. Alex and I were actually out last week filming a video about dry droppers, and we talked about this very setup in the video. And I talked about how I don't like to rig my dry droppers up this way. And there's a couple of reasons that I don't like to do it. First off, when you rig it up this way, if you're not tying it in line, and what that means is you're tying the dropper off the bend of the dry fly hook. So you've got your dry fly to the end of your leader, and then you've got your tippet tied off the bend of that dry fly hook and your nymph tied to that tippet. When you don't tie an inline rig, I've found it's a little bit harder to be accurate with those rigs in my experience. Now, I don't fish these different rigs like an adjustable dry dropper rig or running my dry fly off a tag and leaving my nymph as the point fly like Colin describes. I don't do that very often. So I'm fully aware that my lack of accuracy with it's probably just coming from an unfamiliarity with casting the rig. But I just, at the same time, it just doesn't feel as accurate to me when I'm casting. It's really hard for me to make them behave the way I want them to. So I don't like them for that reason. I also don't like them because you're not in constant contact with that nymph. When your dry fly is drifting independently of your nymph, the way that Colin describes, the nymph eat's got to be pretty stinking hard for you to notice it because you're not going to feel it. You're not going to see your dry fly stop those subtle pauses. You're not going to see that, okay? Because there's so much slack in the rig at that point that unless the fish really commits to eating that nymph, you're going to miss quite a few fish with this sort of rig, just because you're not in constant contact with that nymph unless you're running it in line. Again, my experience, but I've tried these rigs a few different times, especially a lot this summer, and that's been my experience with them, is that you end up missing quite a few fish because you're just not seeing as many takes. So that's my big issue with it, is you're just not going to see as many takes with it. And then the last problem that I have with it is it's just more prone to tangles when you fish a rig like this where they're not in line. You've really got to slow down, open those loops up. The inline rig's just a little bit easier to cast. I think it's a lot more sensitive, and I think it's a lot more accurate. So that's the reason behind why I fish it that way and why I recommend it, why I recommend so many anglers do that as well, because I just think it's the most effective way to run a multi-fly rig, short of going with a tight line nymphing system. So just my 2 cents, but good question, Colin. Thanks for sending it on in. Nathaniel from Colorado's got our next question, writes in and says, question is regarding hook sets specifically for dry flies. Have you found that a standard trout set still provides enough success with single dries, or do you find that setting the hook directly to one side or another gets a better hook set? Are there other instances where you fall back on a sideways hook set, so to speak, or are you team trout set? Nathaniel, good question. For those who don't know, there's 2 main ways to set the hook on a fly rod. You've got the traditional trout set, which you mentioned here, and then you've also got the strip set. A trout set is when you quickly but firmly lift the rod tip while holding the line tight in your rod hand. You want to get tension on it to drive the hook point home. A strip set is used when you're fishing streamers or if you're slowly retrieving nymphs in a lake, and you strip the fly line hard and then use kind of the lower portion of the rod at a side angle to drive that hook point home. Now, the direction of your hook set matters in that you want to make sure you're setting with the current if you're fishing in a river. So if you're set up on this run and let's just, for ease, let's say the current's moving from your right to your left and you are set up in the middle of the run and you're casting kind of upstream, letting the flies drift down in front of you and then coming a little downstream of you there. When a fish takes your fly, whether it's the dry fly or the nymph, and your indicator moves, your dry fly moves, you don't want to set upstream. You don't want to set to your right, okay, because that's going to pull the flies out of the fish's mouth. You want to set to your left. You want to set with the direction that the current is going, because that's going to help use the speed and weight of the current to drive those hook points home and to help get some more tension on that line. So the direction matters in that instance, but the other point of clarity I'll make here is that setting the hook to one side or the other still counts as a trout set, because all you're doing is you're lifting the rod tip and keeping the line tight. And that's the definition of what a trout set is. So whether you're setting to the right or the left doesn't change what kind of hook set it is. And I've never noticed that setting to the right or left, unless you're in a situation like I mentioned where you're fishing that run or that riffle and the flies are drifting back down in front of you. I haven't noticed a big difference ever. The only time when it's really going to matter, when the actual hook set direction is going to matter like that, is if you're fishing in a really tight spot. And I'll give you a story here. A few weeks ago, I'm out fishing and on one of my favorite rivers in the world. And we're walking up, we were fishing a section of it that we'd never fished before. And we get to this beautiful looking hole, kind of your classic big shelf where there's a lot of water rushing and it gets deep really quick and just a lot of turbulence, and it stays deep and then it shallows up very quickly and turns into a riffle. So there's just this big bucket where the fish are holding, and there's a big fish sitting down in it. And I knew there was. I couldn't see it, but it's that spot that looks so fishy. You just think, yeah, there's got to be something in there. The only problem is there was a dead tree the size of the Empire State Building laying across the river. And then there was a giant tangle of roots from runoff that sat on the rest of this pool. So what you ended up with was maybe a 3 or 4 square foot area where you could actually fish, and even less to actually stand. So what I had to do was I had to scramble over the Empire State Tree, climb in through the tangle of roots, and then again, like a 3 or 4 square foot area, I had to drift my flies. And I had all the roots to my right, and then I had some branches hanging off that tree to my left. But the tree was about a foot or two above the water. So I had some space directly to my left where I knew if the fish ate, I was going to have to set the hook very horizontal to drive my rod tip underneath the tree in the space where I actually had some room so that I didn't bang my rod tip into the tree. Because 2 reasons I didn't want to do that. First, hitting trees with your fly rod's a great way to break it, and that's never fun. And then second, if you set the hook hard and you bounce right onto a tree immediately or some other obstacle, that can take a little bit of tension off the fly line and the hook can pop free. And then the third reason too is if you set the hook on something that's not a fish and your flies come shooting out of the water at 80 miles an hour, you don't want to end up tangled. Especially in a situation where there's a lot of water, it's moving very quickly, you probably couldn't reach your flies. So I was very careful about where the hook set was going to need to go if I hooked into a fish. Now, I hooked into a fish, and I made the perfect hook set. It went right to the left. I didn't hit the tree. The fish was on, but I still didn't keep enough tension on because the fish jumped once and spat the hooks, and I almost cried. So, but the moral of the story is, those are the situations when the hook set direction matters. Other than that, it all comes back to principles. Okay. Your hook set needs to firmly but quickly lift the rod, keep tension on the line, and drive that hook point home. However you accomplish that is fine, but that's what your hook set needs to do. So I appreciate the question, Nathaniel. Thank you so much for sending it in. And with that, folks, we're going to move on to the Live Real Life moment of this week's show. Every week here at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and pictures from folks who are out there living real life. We love to hear about your adventures and take part in them. It's just a lot of fun to connect with y'all and see what y'all are up to. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to submit, you go ahead and do that. There's a link to share yours in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Craig. My brother Brian and I were born in Colorado to a Colorado family, but grew up mostly in Texas. We often heard great stories of the many fishing trips our father took with his father on the Gunnison River in the 1950s. In Grandpa's bedroom in Denver hung a classic photo of a 25-inch rainbow lying beside his old wicker creel and his rod and reel. But the stories always ended with lamentations about the building of the dam which created the Blue Mesa Reservoir, flooded the town of Iola, and buried their favorite fishery forever under 340 feet of water. We visited Denver and the Front Range often as children, and my brother has lived back there for the past 30 years. But we never traveled much into the interior and just assumed, in the way that children do, that the Gunnison just didn't exist anymore. Fast forward to October 2023, when Brian and I decided to accompany our stepbrothers Cliff and Corby on Corby's annual elk hunt in the national forest just north of the Blue Mesa Reservoir. Our route from Missouri, where the three of us now live, took us through the town of Gunnison and along the Gunnison River, right up to and across Blue Mesa Dam. It was magical to discover that the river still exists and to learn that it is still some of Colorado's best trout fishing water. Who knew? Brian and I were fly fishing newbies that year and managed to break away from elk camp for just one day. We drove 2 hours back down to the river, spent the day wading, casting, and bumbling. We both got one serious strike each, and neither of us fell in, so we called it a successful first day of fly fishing. In September of this year, we returned with the elk party with more knowledge about fly fishing and much better casts to offer the river. And this year, our camp was just 20 minutes from the North Fork of the Gunnison, not far from where it joins the Big Gunny. This year would be different. The first day out on the North Fork, I was still struggling, trying to remember everything I was supposed to remember about casting, presentation, drift, reading the water, etc. After an hour with no action, frustration levels started to grow. And then I remembered to look around, remember where I was, and that I was supposed to be enjoying myself. I decided to relax and focus on improving my casts and drifts. If that's all I could get done that day on the water, then that would still be a win. The fly shop had assured us that grasshoppers were the thing to throw, so I was confident I had the right fly and had no trouble watching the big foam-wrapped fly move on the water. I noticed a large boulder sticking out of the water just ahead. Remembering what I'd learned about pockets and holes, I decided to try and drift a hopper over the hole below the rock. I cast upstream several times, mended well, but each time watched the current take the fly around the boulder and fling it out into the fast water away from the hole. After several more tries, I finally figured out where to place the fly to get it to hug right up against the boulder and then drop into the pool below. And that's when it happened. I saw a dark shape shoot up from under the boulder, grab my fly, and bend my pole almost before I knew what had happened. Fish on! Finally! I worked for a minute to get him into my net and stood staring proudly at my first real fly-caught trout, a beautiful 12-inch brown. I can still replay the whole thing in my memory like it was yesterday. In 2 days of fishing the North Fork, I caught another medium-sized brown, 2 small rainbows. Brian put a few in the net as well. Day 3, I was solo, moved onto the Big Gunny. The big, featureless water was intimidating, and I got skunked in part by the wind, which had picked up considerably. But it was still better than a good day at work. Brian and I and 2 of our sons are now looking for opportunities to fish anytime we can get together. We're hoping to fish for trout and smallmouth on the 11 Point here in the Missouri Ozarks next spring, but we both agree that the Gunnison is our legacy water and hope to get back there again next fall. Craig, that's awesome. I love that. It's a very well told story. You took us right along for the ride. That's awesome. Going back to those childhood fisheries, the family fisheries where you've got some legacy is really cool. It's a really unique experience. I've been fortunate to have that myself as well. So I think you communicated that feeling very, very well. Again, good job, and thank you so much for sending that story in. And with that, folks, we're going to go ahead and wrap up the show this week. Thank you so much for watching and listening to the entire show. It matters more to us than you can know. If you haven't already, please make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life, which is the whole goal of VFC. We want you all to have those amazing experiences out there on the water. So I'll quit yammering so you can get out, go have some fun, and until next week, live real life.